Good morning, my friends. Today we're going to be learning the 7th chapter in the laws of idol worship in the Rambam. Now, before I begin, I just want to mention a very beautiful thing, some feedback that I got on the classes of the study of Rambam, where I was speaking to someone here in town, and he mentioned to me that he's been getting the Rambam every day in his feed on Facebook, and he was listening to the class about idol worship and we're not allowed to serve idols, etc. And he was thinking about it on a practical level in his own life, where he's thinking about the various things which he worships, so to speak, various things in life, and he was trying to take a very practical outcome from what was being taught in the class. And I found this to be very special because we're learning about various ideas, various laws, certain things that we're allowed to do, certain things that we're not allowed to do. And some of it is a little bit abstract. We're not really dealing with cities of people that are serving idols. It's not something which we're, on our day-to-day life, it's not something which we're coming in contact with. But I really appreciated this, where he was taking this practical, real thing out from what was being studied and to make it a reality in our day-to-day life. So I just wanted to mention this, which was very beautiful, and I think we can all learn from this and take out a practical day-to-day lesson from what we are learning in the Rambam. So today we're getting to chapter 7 in the laws of idol worship, where the Rambam is going to be discussing various things of what we are not or are allowed to have enjoyment from idols and idol worship. So he begins off by saying that we have a mitzvah, there is a commandment in the Torah which says that we are supposed to destroy any idols and anything that is used for idol worship in the land of Israel. So if we're in the land of Israel, anything that belongs to idol worship must be destroyed. When we're outside of the land of Israel, that mitzvah does not apply. Now, this applies to the idol itself, but also it applies to all the various accessories that are used for the worship of the idol. And we're not allowed to have any pleasure or enjoyment from it. So, for instance, if you have an animal that was brought as a sacrifice for an idol, so then the entire animal is... If the entire animal was brought and used as a sacrifice, then we're not allowed to use the entire animal. Every part of the animal, whether it's the hooves or the skin or any other part of the animal, we're not allowed to use it. So if there is an animal that, for instance, there were back in the days, they had a way of how they would cut out the heart of the animal as a sign of worship for a certain idol. So if you find a piece of skin which you see that the heart was cut out from it, so then you would know that this came from idol worshippers, and one would not be allowed to use that piece of hide. So there is actually a difference in regards to something which was used for idol worship by a Jew or by a non-Jew. So if we have a non-Jew who is serving idols, so then the moment they set it aside to be used for idol worship, even though they didn't actually use it yet, it would already be classified as not allowed to be used. But a Jew, it will only become not allowed to be used, and we're not allowed to derive any pleasure from this thing once they actually use it and serve and worship that idol with the thing. So now, what about a person who is creating something which is going to be used for idol worship, and he sells it to an idol worshiper, and he knows it's going to be used for idol worship? So, what about is that? Although he's not allowed to do it, but what about the money that he's gaining from it? He's getting paid for it. So, the truth is that until the item which he made is not fully complete, it's not going to be fit for use. And that last the last push of the hammer to make this item to be fit for use is not really worth anything. So therefore, there isn't the making it befitting to be used for idol worship only comes at that time, and therefore, because that's not really worth a specific amount, so therefore he's allowed to have enjoyment from that money. Now, what about if someone buys some scraps of metal from a person who is an idol worshiper, and as he's going through these scraps of metal, he finds a piece of an idol. So he has to throw it all out if he's not able to retract on the purchase. Now, when we're talking about various images that the idol worshippers use, for instance, they have various statues and images and so on. So if it's in a little town, a village, so over there it's going to be a given that this was an actual idol and used for idolatry. So then we're not allowed to derive any pleasure from it. But if we're in a city and we're talking about like a certain statue, which we're not sure if this is an idol or not, so it depends. So if it's an idol if it's a big statue that has like a sword or holding a globe or has a crown, so then we would be more turning to think that it actually is an idol. But if it's just a regular statue, it's probably just for beauty, and then you're allowed to have enjoyment from it. It's not a big deal. But if you find broken, thrown away statues in the garbage, so then you are allowed to do it, because that means that they stopped using it and it was nullified, so to speak, from being an idol. And now once it has been nullified, so now it's not an idol anymore, and we're allowed to have enjoyment and use it. But if you find just a little piece of it, so then probably the rest of the statue is still standing, and then just this piece is still connected to that idol which is still standing, and we're not allowed to use it unless we know for a fact that the rest of the idol was destroyed. Now, what about if a person finds a cup or a vessel of sorts, and it has like a little moon or a star or a sun on it? So if it was an expensive vessel made out of gold or silver or expensive material, so then we would estimate that it's probably an idol worshipping emblem or picture on it. But if it's just disposable or something which is cheaper material, then it's probably not there for idol worshipping purposes, but rather just for beautification and aesthetics, and it's okay. Now, when we're talking about the various idols and its accessories and so on, so we're not allowed to have any enjoyment from it, as we said, but the truth is that we're not allowed to have any enjoyment even from a little tiny drop of it. Meaning, if you have 100 vessels, 100 pots, and one of them is being in use for an idol worshiper. An idol worshiper is using it to serve an idol. He's using that pot for that purpose. And now that pot gets mixed in with a whole bunch of other pots. What happens now? We don't know which one it is. Are you allowed to use those pots or not? So because we're not allowed to have any enjoyment even from just a little bit of it, even just a tiny drop, so therefore all the pots will not be allowed to be used. And similar to any other case. So that's pretty harsh. And similar also if you have an idol tree, which is called the Asherah tree. So if you have a little piece of that tree, also, if it gets mixed in with other pieces of wood, so then the same thing would happen. Now, what about if you have that? What about if you have that piece of the, whatever vessel or thing that belonged to the idol worship, and now it got mixed in to to this big pile of other stuff, and now you don't know what it is. But now from that big pile, it fell into a second pile. Now, what about that? Are you allowed to have any enjoyment over there? So the law would be that it is. Because if it's a questionable doubt, so irregular doubt, you're not allowed to have, you still would not be allowed to enjoy. But if it's a questionable doubt, so it's not just one doubt, but it's a double doubt, so then it will be okay. If you have little chicks in this tree of idol worship, so then if they're bigger chicks and now they don't really need a tree for their survival, for their sustenance, so then you're allowed to enjoy them. But if these chicks are very, very small and they still need to be in their nest with their mom and in the tree, so then you're not allowed to enjoy them. But I don't think there's any trees of idol worship around here, so I think we're cool. The actual twigs and sticks that make the nest on that tree would be allowed because they come from other trees. Now, what about if a person did use part of that tree, chopped it up, and used it to heat up their oven back in the day? So they would have to wait for the oven to cool down and then use other sticks, other wood, and heat up their oven like that. But if they didn't let the oven cool down and they baked bread in with that heat which was created by something which was an idol, so then they should throw that bread out. If a person took a little piece of wood from the tree and used it as a shuttle and wove a garment with it, so then that we would not be allowed to wear that garment. And if that garment got mixed in with other garments, so what happens now? So you're supposed to take the money, the worth of that garment, and throw it into the ocean as to show that we're not going to have enjoyment from that. Similarly, if you have a tree of the Asherah tree, which is an idol worshipping tree, we're not allowed to use its shade for enjoyment. Now, there's an interesting law which the Rambam gives, and he says that in general, if we have something which is using partially something which is not allowed, something which is forbidden for use, and something which is partially allowed, so then it will be okay. So for instance, if we have vegetables which are growing and you plant them under the tree and they're enjoying the shade of the tree, which is going to help them grow. But on the other hand, their real sustenance is coming from the ground. It's not coming from the tree. And the ground is allowed. That's okay. So then you would be allowed to eat those vegetables. So even though they're getting some nutrition, so to speak, they're getting some help from the shade of the tree that are helping these plants grow, but since they're also getting some nutrients from the ground, so then it will be allowed. So in general, the rule is if you have two things that are making this happen, one which is allowed, one which is not allowed, it would be okay. Or similar, if you have an animal which you want to fatten it up and you give it food which was used for idol worship, so then you're allowed to eat that animal because although it's getting sustenance from that food, it also was getting sustenance from other ways, and then it would be allowed. If you have wine or meat or fruits that were prepared for sacrifices that were going to be brought for an idol, so although it was set aside and prepared, as long as it wasn't actually brought into the place of worship, into the shrine or whatever, so then you would be allowed to use it. But the moment it was in there and it was actually brought up to be used for the idol, so then you're not allowed to use it under any circumstance. Now, what about if a person finds clothing or money or a vessel near a statue, near an idol? Would it be allowed to be used? Now, these are things that not necessarily we come across in the day-to-day life, but it's a very interesting idea to know. And again, as we said at the beginning, just take the message, the deeper message over here. And so if a person finds something money, clothing, near an idol. So then it depends. If it's there in a degrading form, for instance, if you found like a bag of money hanging on the neck of the idol, so then it will be okay, because it's definitely not there as a sign of worship. But if he finds it there in a way of honor, so then he would not be allowed. And the various idols that are mentioned in the Torah that we mentioned in yesterday's class, we would not be allowed to use anything which is there, even if it's in a degrading form. The Torah clearly says that we're not allowed to have any use from them, and therefore we're not allowed to use it. Now, what about if you have a bathhouse, for instance, that belongs to an idol worshiper or a place of idol worship? Are we allowed to use that shower or bathhouse or a garden? So then, truth is that the Rambam says, so it depends. So if we're not going to be supporting that idol, so in other words, you're not paying for that use, so then it's allowed. But if it's going to be, if you have to pay for it, so then that's something which would not be allowed. What about if you have a bathhouse which has an actual idol hanging or standing within the bathhouse? So the Rambam says it's still fine, because it's only there for aesthetic reasons, just to make it nice, and it's not really there for worship. And people are taking a bath or swimming, they're not really serving idols. But it's, unless this was a way of the form of the way a person was supposed to be worshiping it, but for the general, it would be okay. Last law for today is that if a person has a knife that belongs to an idol worshiper, which is something which was used for idol worship, it would be allowed to use that knife, because a knife is usually detracting from the animal's value when you slaughter it. But if the animal was very sick and was about to die, and now you quickly have to slaughter the animal in order to be able to eat the meat before it dies, so then since you're actually enhancing its value, so then you would not be allowed to use it. And in general, a person wouldn't be able to use it just to slice meat, because similarly it would also be enhancing the value of the meat. But if he was just doing in order to with the destructive intent, cutting and chopping it up, and not in a way to value the meat, but rather destroy it, so then that will be allowed. So, but that's the chapter of today in the Rambam, where we learn about the various factions and the various objects and things and styles of what we are not allowed to have enjoyment from, things that are for idol worship, and certain scenarios where it would be allowed. And on a practical level, when we're looking at it in our own life, certain things in our life, we have to keep very, very far away from them. There are certain things that are destructive, these are detrimental. We have to delete them entirely from our life. Certain things which are not good for us, but we're able to extract from them certain goodness. So maybe on a practical level, that's something which we can take, and as we walk away from this chapter, internalize something, make that something real in our day-to-day life. So have a very good one, my friends. We will continue later on with the next chapter. All the best. We will see you.